Have you ever wondered how well you truly know your neighbors? In the heart of Florida lies the tranquil town of Reddick, where neighbors share smiles, and the nights whisper tales of peace. But on this fateful evening, an unthinkable act would shatter the town's innocence. A 14-year-old boy, familiar to all, would commit a crime so heinous, it would forever alter the fabric of this close-knit community. This is the story of trust betrayed, innocence lost, and the darkness that can reside within. Before we touch on this shocking story, kindly take a second to subscribe to this channel. Thank you, and we love you so much. Now let's get into it. Have you ever seen a kid and thought, that child is missing something? Not food, not clothes, something deeper. Something that can't be bought. Well, stability. Guidance. Jesse Stone was one of those kids. From the outside he looked like any other boy, young, quiet, a little awkward. But behind closed doors his life was far from normal. He never knew what it felt like to have a mother's warmth or a father's strong presence. His mother? Barely there. His father? A name, a rumor, a ghost. So Jesse was raised by his paternal grandmother, a woman who did what she could, but let's be honest, raising a teenage boy when you're already exhausted by life? It's not easy. She was strict. Not in a loving, I do this because I care way, but in a you better not cause me any trouble way. She put food on the table, made sure he went to school, but emotionally? Jesse was alone. And when kids feel alone, they find ways to fill the void. Jesse wasn't just a kid with a rough upbringing, he was a kid battling demons no one could see. Depression? It clung to him like a shadow, dragging him down day after day. ADHD? It made school unbearable. He couldn't sit still, couldn't focus, couldn't keep up. Teachers grew frustrated, classmates lost patience, and Jesse? He just started checking out. But his biggest struggle? The one that no one saw coming? Pornography. It started as curiosity. A click here, a video there. But soon it became an escape, his way of numbing everything he couldn't control. The loneliness, the rejection, the emptiness. And like any addiction, it grew. The more he watched, the less it satisfied him. His mind became warped, reality and fantasy started to blur, and soon he wasn't just watching, he was craving. But here's the thing, no one noticed. No one asked if he was okay. No one pulled him aside and said, Jesse, what's going on? Because to the outside world, Jesse Stone was just a quiet boy trying to find his place. Ask the neighbors about Jesse and you'd hear the same thing. He was a nice kid. A little shy but respectful. He was the boy who would hold the door open at the gas station. The one who would help an older neighbor carry groceries. He wasn't causing trouble, wasn't running with a bad crowd. He was just there. And maybe that's why no one saw it coming. Because when a kid like Jesse does something unthinkable, the first thing people say is, but he seems so normal. But was he ever really normal? Or was he just a kid no one looked at closely enough? June 9, 2024, was supposed to be like any other summer night in Reddick, Florida. The town was quiet, the streets bathed in the glow of the moon, and for one 91-year-old woman, it was just another evening in the home she had lived in for over 5 decades. Her name? Let's call her Margaret Lewis. Margaret had seen this town change over the years. She had been there when families first planted their roots, when small businesses popped up along the main road, and when children she once babysat grew up and had kids of their own. She was known. She was loved. Born in 1933, Margaret had lived through the Great Depression, World War II, and more historical moments than most people could even fathom. She had been a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, and later, a grandmother and great-grandmother. But above all, Margaret was strong. She had married young, like many women of her generation, and spent her early years raising a family. Her husband, Robert, had been the love of her life. They built their little home in Reddick together, back when the town was even smaller, and people left their doors unlocked without a second thought. But Robert had passed away nearly 20 years ago. It was sudden, an unexpected heart attack one morning while reading the newspaper. Margaret had been devastated, but if life had taught her anything, it was resilience. She grieved, she adjusted, and she carried on. Because that's what women like Margaret did. Even in her 90s, she remained fiercely independent. She still cooked her own meals, still swept her porch every morning, still walked to the mailbox at exactly 2 p.m. each day, rain or shine. Neighbors often marveled at her energy. "How do you do it, Miss Margaret?" they would ask. She'd laugh, wave them off, and say, "I just keep moving, darling. The moment you stop is the moment you start fading away." Margaret's days were predictable, steady, just the way she liked them. She'd wake up early, usually before the sun had fully risen. Old habits die hard, and Margaret had spent most of her life waking up at dawn to make breakfast for her family. Even now, with no one but herself to cook for, she kept the routine. A cup of black coffee, a slice of toast with a little jam, and the local newspaper spread out on her kitchen table. She loved reading the obituaries, not out of morbidity but out of respect. These people lived. They mattered. She always whispered a quiet prayer for the names she recognized. By mid-morning she'd take a slow walk around her yard. Her garden, once full of vibrant flowers, had become more manageable with age. Just a few potted plants on her porch, some wildflowers that grew along the fence. She'd water them, talk to them softly. Then came her favorite part of the day, the visits. Neighbors would stop by, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to bring her a home-cooked meal. She always had a glass of sweet tea ready just in case. She loved company, loved the stories, loved feeling like a part of something bigger than herself. And Jesse Stone? He was one of those visitors. He had started stopping by a year or so ago, just small moments here and there. A polite boy, Margaret thought. He would ask about her day, listen to her old stories, even offer to help with small chores. She had no idea what was brewing inside him. No idea that, in his mind, she had already become something much more sinister. That on the night of June 9th, the boy she had once welcomed onto her porch would shatter everything. June 8, 2024. A Saturday. The Florida sun had started its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the quiet streets of Reddick. The air was thick with humidity, cicadas humming their familiar summer tune. It was one of those evenings where time seemed to slow down, where the world felt still, almost peaceful. Margaret Lewis sat on her front porch, gently rocking in her old wooden chair. A glass of sweet tea rested on the small table beside her, condensation dripping down the sides. She took a slow sip, savoring the coolness against the warmth of the evening. Then footsteps. Light, unhurried. A familiar sound by now. She turned her head slightly and smiled. Evening, Jesse. There he was, walking up her driveway like he had so many times before. Jesse Stone, 14 years old, lanky, a little awkward. He had that quiet politeness about him, the kind that made people trust him. There was nothing threatening about Jesse. No rough edges, no signs of trouble. At least that's what everyone thought. "Hey, Miss Margaret," he said, stuffing his hands into the pockets of his worn-out jeans. "You doing okay?" She chuckled, the sound soft, warm. "Well, I'm 91 years old, Jesse. Every day I wake up is a good day." Jesse smiled, but there was something off about it. Something that, maybe in another life, Margaret would have noticed. A tightness around the edges. A flicker of something in his eyes. But she didn't notice. Because why would she? Margaret patted the empty rocking chair next to her. "Come sit a spell." Jesse hesitated for just a second, then did as he was told. And for the next 20 minutes, it was just like any other evening. They talked. About nothing, about everything. Jesse asked how her garden was doing, if she'd seen the new neighbors down the road, if she still planned on baking a pie for the church social next week. Margaret, always happy for company, answered every question with warmth, with patience. "You remind me of my grandson, you know," she said at one point, looking at him with those kind, weathered eyes. "Always so polite. You're a good boy, Jesse. A good boy." Jesse's hands gripped the armrest of the chair. His breath hitched just slightly, but he forced a smile. "Thank you, Miss Margaret." But in his mind, something was unraveling. Because Jesse wasn't a good boy. Not really. Not anymore. And tomorrow he was going to prove it. As the sun dipped lower, Margaret yawned, stretching her frail arms. "I should be heading inside," she said. "Getting too old to sit out here all night?" Jesse nodded, standing up as she did. But there was something in the way he watched her. His eyes lingering just a second too long. Margaret turned to go inside, her front door creaking as she pushed it open. Before stepping in, she glanced back at Jesse and gave him one final smile. "Don't be a stranger now," she said. "And Jesse?" He just stood there, watching as she disappeared into the house. His hands curled into fists. His heart pounded against his ribs. Because this wasn't just a visit. This wasn't just another evening chat. This was the last time she'd see him as the Jesse she thought she knew. Tomorrow everything would change. June 9th, 2024. Midnight. The town of Reddick was asleep. Streetlights flickered, their dim glow stretching across empty sidewalks. The occasional rustling of leaves, the distant chirp of crickets. These were the only sounds of the night. Inside her small home, Margaret Lewis lay in bed, lost in the kind of deep sleep that only comes with age. The world outside was still, peaceful. She had no idea that, just beyond her front porch, someone was standing in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. Jesse Stone stood there, his breath slow, controlled. His fingers twitched at his sides. His body buzzed with something he couldn't quite explain. An energy, an urge, a hunger. This was it. He had thought about it all day. Every moment replaying in his mind. The sound of her voice calling him a good boy. The way she smiled at him, completely unaware. The trust. That trust made it easy. Jesse exhaled sharply, his eyes flickering to the front door. Locked. Of course it was locked. But he had already planned for that. He had been in this house before. He knew Margaret's routine, knew her habits. And he knew something else. Margaret was old. She wasn't like other people. She didn't double-check locks. She didn't install security cameras. She didn't believe in the kind of evil that lurked in the dark. Jesse crept around the house, his sneakers barely making a sound against the grass. His fingers trailed along the old wooden siding as he moved toward the back. The kitchen window. It was small, barely big enough for someone his size. But Jesse was young, wiry, determined. The latch clicked softly as he jimmied it open. And then silence. For a moment he just stood there, the window cracked open, his hands gripping the ledge. This was the point of no return. One last chance to turn around. To go home. To forget this. But Jesse didn't turn around. He climbed. The air inside the house was cool, tinged with the familiar scent of old books and lavender, Margaret's signature smell. Jesse crouched low, his breath steady, ears straining for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. Just the soft hum of the refrigerator, the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. He moved carefully, his footsteps barely disturbing the linoleum floor. His heart pounded. He wasn't afraid. He was excited. The hallway stretched before him, dark and quiet. He had walked this hallway before in daylight, when Margaret had led him to the kitchen, offering him cookies, asking him about school. Now it felt different. Now it felt forbidden. He reached her bedroom door. It was slightly ajar. Margaret was inside, asleep, completely unaware. Jesse stood there, staring into the darkness, his fingers tightening into fists. This was it. This was the moment. The moment where he stopped being a kid. The moment where there was no going back. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. And then he pushed the door open. The night had been quiet. Peaceful. Margaret Lewis, 91 years old, lay curled beneath her patchwork quilt, her frail body sinking into the mattress. Sleep had come easily, the kind of deep rest that only the elderly know. Their bodies tired, their minds free of the worries that keep younger people awake at night. But then, something changed. A sound. Faint. Almost imperceptible. A creak in the floorboards. Margaret stirred but didn't fully wake. Probably just the house settling, she thought. Old houses did that. Then, another sound. Closer this time. Her eyelids fluttered, her mind groggy, slow to register the disturbance. And then, the presence. A shadow. A figure. Standing at the foot of her bed. The air turned thick with something unspoken, something dark. Margaret's breath hitched, her pulse quickening as confusion wrapped around her like a vice. Her old, weary eyes strained in the darkness, searching. Who's there? She rasped, her voice fragile. Silence. And then a whisper. Miss Margaret, it's me. The voice was familiar. Jesse? For a split second, relief washed over her. Jesse, the boy from next door. The polite boy who always stopped by to chat. The boy she had welcomed onto her porch just yesterday. But something was wrong. Why was he here? In her bedroom? Margaret struggled to sit up, but her limbs were slow, uncooperative. Fear crept into her bones. Jesse, what are you doing here? Her voice trembled, but she tried to keep it steady. Jesse didn't answer. Not right away. Instead he just stood there. Watching. And Margaret? She suddenly knew. Something terrible was about to happen. His heart pounded, but not with fear. With something else. Something darker. Something that had been festering inside him for weeks, months, maybe years. He had told himself he wasn't going to do it. He had told himself he was just going to see her one last time, maybe take something small, something meaningless. But now, standing in her room, watching her fragile body shift beneath the covers, something inside him snapped. She wasn't afraid yet. She didn't understand. But she would. Margaret's eyes locked onto his, wide, searching. Jesse, she whispered. You don't have to do this. And for the first time he felt it. Doubt. A crack in his resolve. But it was too late. Because in the next breath, Margaret tried to move. Tried to get up. Tried to scream. And Jesse couldn't let that happen. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He stopped her. And in that moment, Jesse Stone was no longer a boy. He beat her and assaulted her. Sadly. The steady, rhythmic steps of a neighbor, making their way down the street just past Margaret's house. Her heart beat loudly in her chest, the pain of what had just occurred still fresh, but she fought it, fought the instinct to stay silent, to let the darkness swallow her whole. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the phone on her bedside table. Her fingers, stiff with age and fear, fumbled to press the numbers. But somehow, with a strength she didn't know she had, she dialed. 911, what's your emergency? Her voice came out in a rasp, weak and broken. It's Margaret. Someone's hurt me. The operator's voice was calm, steady. Stay with me, Margaret. Help is on the way. And with that, Margaret held on. She held on long enough for the sound of sirens to fill the air. The flashing blue and red lights cut through the quiet night like a beacon of hope. Deputies from the Marion County Sheriff's Office arrived swiftly, their cars skidding to a halt in front of Margaret's home. The officers, though trained for such scenes, couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just another call. This was an elderly woman, someone's grandmother, someone's mother, hurt in her own home. As they entered the house, the officers were met with the aftermath of a crime so brutal, so vile, that it left a cold chill in the air. Margaret was barely conscious, her body bruised and battered. But her eyes, they were still there. She was still fighting. One deputy knelt beside her, his voice soft but urgent. Ma'am, we need to know what happened. Can you tell us who did this? Margaret, her face pale, managed to whisper, it was Jesse. Jesse Stone. The officers exchanged a glance. They knew the name. Jesse was a familiar face in Reddick, a quiet boy, a neighbor, one of their own. But they didn't question her now. They moved quickly, gathering what they could, ensuring Margaret was given the medical care she so desperately needed. As the medical team tended to Margaret, the law enforcement officers set to work collecting evidence. A crime scene is a delicate thing. Every detail matters, every piece of evidence crucial in piecing together the truth. They combed through the house, carefully documenting the scene. Bloodstains, broken furniture, signs of a violent struggle. But it was the DNA evidence that would prove to be the key. A discarded piece of clothing in the corner, fibers found in Margaret's bedding, the faint traces of sweat and saliva on the victim's body, all of it pointed to one thing. Jesse Stone had been there. But could they prove it? The morning after the assault, Jesse Stone was arrested. The deputies arrived at his home, their presence sending a wave of tension through the small, quiet neighborhood. Jesse's grandmother, who had raised him, was shocked, horrified. She couldn't understand how the polite boy she'd cared for could have committed such a horrific act. Jesse, still young, still trying to make sense of what he had done, was taken into custody. At first he denied everything. I didn't do it, Jesse said repeatedly, his voice shaky but defiant. I don't know what you're talking about. But the evidence spoke for itself. The DNA, the fibers, the marks on Margaret's body, all pointed to Jesse. And so, as the investigators sat him down, he broke. I went to her house, Jesse confessed. I didn't mean for it to happen. I don't know what came over me. I don't know. His words came out in a jumble, as if he was trying to make sense of his own actions. But there was no going back now. Jesse Stone, 14 years old, had shattered a quiet community. He had taken something from Margaret that could never be given back. And in doing so, he had lost his innocence, his childhood, forever. As the officers placed him under arrest, the weight of the situation settled in. The boy they had known was gone. What remained was a teenager, staring down a future he could never have imagined. And Margaret? She was left with the haunting reality of what had happened in the stillness of her own home. As Jesse Stone sat in the courtroom, facing the consequences of his actions, the weight of the charges against him became undeniable. The quiet of the room seemed to amplify every word the prosecutor spoke as the charges were read aloud. Burglary with battery, for unlawfully entering the home of 91-year-old Margaret Lewis with the intent to harm, and violently assaulting her. Sexual battery, for the rape and sexual assault of a defenseless elderly woman in her own home. These charges were not just numbers or legal terms. They were the heavy truth of what Jesse had done. They were the words that represented the destruction of a woman's sense of safety, of her dignity, and the irreversible changes that would haunt her forever. As the prosecutor laid out the facts, the room fell into a somber silence. Margaret was a beloved figure in the community, and the thought of someone, especially a young boy, committing such brutal acts against her seemed almost impossible to fathom. Jesse had been a neighbor, someone who had chatted with Margaret just a day before. Now he was the perpetrator of an unspeakable crime. The charges weren't just about the assault. They were a stark reminder that no one, no matter how old or trusted, was immune to harm. Jesse's defense attorney stood up, the weight of the moment evident in their posture. There was no denying the seriousness of the charges, but the defense was not here to deny what had happened. Instead, they were here to ask for something else: mercy. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, we do not seek to minimize or excuse Jesse's actions, the defense lawyer began, their voice calm but firm. We acknowledge the horrific nature of this crime, and we do not ask you to forget the suffering of the victim, Margaret Lewis. But we ask you to consider something crucial. Jesse Stone is not yet a fully formed adult. He is still a boy, and this moment does not define the entirety of his life. The defense continued to build their case, drawing attention to Jesse's troubled past, one marked by pain and neglect. Raised by his paternal grandmother due to absent parents, Jesse had faced challenges many children his age couldn't even begin to understand. His upbringing, they argued, had been marked by instability and a lack of proper guidance. Jesse has been diagnosed with depression and ADHD. He has struggled for years with his mental health, feeling isolated, misunderstood, and lost. These conditions, combined with an addiction to pornography, have warped his sense of reality and led him down a dangerous path, the defense attorney explained. They spoke of Jesse's troubled mind, his need for therapy, and his inability to comprehend the true weight of his actions due to his still developing brain. At 14, Jesse's mind is far from fully developed. He lacks the emotional maturity to fully understand the consequences of his actions. This is not to excuse what he did, but to explain why it happened. The attorney emphasized Jesse's lack of a prior criminal record, pointing to the boy's history of being a polite, helpful member of the community before the crime. They asked the jury to see him not as a monster, but as a deeply troubled child, still in need of care and guidance. We are asking for a chance for rehabilitation, the attorney said, their voice softening. Jesse needs a chance to grow, to understand what he's done, and to receive the psychological and emotional treatment he desperately needs. He doesn't need to be thrown into an adult prison system where his chances for recovery are slim. What he needs is a chance to heal, to become the man he could have been if given the right tools and support. The plea was clear. Jesse was a boy who had made a tragic mistake, and he could be redeemed with the right care. In the moments that followed, the room became heavy with contemplation. On one side, the defense had painted a picture of a troubled youth, one who had suffered and been misguided but was still capable of change. On the other side, the prosecution reminded everyone of the severity of the crime, a life-altering event for an elderly woman who would never recover from the attack. Jesse had made a choice, and the consequences of that choice were irreversible. But the question still remained: what would the court decide? Was mercy appropriate for a boy who had taken away Margaret's safety, her peace of mind, her dignity? Or was it more important to send a message that such violent acts, no matter the age of the perpetrator, would not be excused? The jury would soon deliberate, weighing the arguments of both sides, and decide what justice truly meant for Jesse Stone. After days of arguments, testimonies, and emotional appeals, the time had come for the court to decide Jesse Stone's fate. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick with anticipation, everyone waiting for the judge to deliver the final word. The judge, Circuit Judge Lisa Herndon, called the court to attention, her voice steady and clear. The silence was profound, the kind that only occurs when a life-changing decision is about to be made. Jesse Stone, the judge began, her gaze fixed on the young boy who sat quietly in his seat. The crime you committed on June 9, 2024, was horrific. It was an act of unspeakable violence that will forever alter the life of the victim, Margaret Lewis. No matter what your past may have been, no matter the circumstances of your upbringing, this crime was not just a mistake. It was a calculated, violent assault on an innocent elderly woman in her own home. Jesse sat still, his eyes lowered. His defense attorney had pleaded for mercy, calling on the boy's troubled upbringing and mental health challenges as reasons to consider leniency. But the prosecutor had made it clear that some actions cannot be overlooked, no matter how young the perpetrator. The court has considered all factors, Judge Herndon continued. The defense's plea for rehabilitation, the victim's suffering, and the need for justice. After reviewing the evidence, the testimonies, and the emotional toll this has taken on all parties involved, I am ready to pronounce the sentence. The room seemed to hold its breath. Jesse Stone, I hereby sentence you to 25 years in prison for the charges of burglary with battery and sexual battery. Following your prison sentence, you will serve 30 years of sex offender probation. You will also be required to register as a sex offender and enroll in anger management classes as part of your rehabilitation. The words echoed in the courtroom. 25 years. 30 years of probation. a lifetime of consequences for one tragic decision. Jesse's face remained impassive, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a subtle tension in his shoulders that spoke volumes. His defense attorney had hoped for a lighter sentence, possibly a juvenile facility or treatment program, but the severity of the crime had led the judge to impose a sentence that reflected the gravity of Jesse's actions. The sentence was not just about punishment, it was about ensuring that Jesse would have the opportunity to seek the help he desperately needed. The court's decision acknowledged his mental health struggles, but also made it clear that justice for the victim could not be sacrificed. In the aftermath, Jesse's grandmother, his only remaining family, sat quietly, her face a mask of grief. The pain of what had transpired was visible in her eyes, but there was no escaping the reality. Her grandson, the boy she had raised, had committed an unforgivable act. The family would never be the same. As Jesse was led out of the courtroom, the full weight of the sentence began to sink in. For the next 25 years he would be confined to a prison cell. He would have time to reflect on the violence he had inflicted, but that reflection would come with a heavy price. For Margaret Lewis, justice had been served, but the trauma of what she had endured would stay with her for the rest of her life. The scars of that night could never be erased, no matter the legal outcome. The sentence was a reminder that, in the eyes of the law, actions have consequences, especially when those actions devastate innocent lives. The community of Reddick, once peaceful and close-knit, would also feel the impact of this case for years to come. It had forever changed the lives of everyone involved. And so, with the sentence delivered, the chapter closed, but the ripples of this tragedy would continue to echo in the hearts and minds of those affected. After the brutal assault, 91-year-old Margaret Lewis faced a difficult recovery. Her injuries were severe, but she showed incredible strength in the face of pain. Hospitalized for her wounds, the physical scars were only part of the challenge. The emotional toll was deep, especially as she struggled with the loss of her independence in her own home. With support from family and friends, she began to heal, but the trauma of that night lingered. She fought hard in physical therapy to regain strength, though each day brought a reminder of what she had endured. The emotional scars were far harder to heal. Margaret struggled with fear and anxiety, often waking in the middle of the night, haunted by memories of the assault. At first, leaving her home was unimaginable, but over time, therapy and the support of her community helped her regain some sense of normalcy. The fear never fully disappeared, but Margaret's resilience shone through as she fought to reclaim her confidence. Margaret's recovery wasn't just her journey, it was the town of Reddick's too. The attack had shaken everyone, but the community rallied around her. Neighbors who had known her for years stepped in, offering support, meals, and company. The collective grief of the town made Margaret's healing a shared experience, showing just how connected the people of Reddick were. Though the emotional and physical scars would never completely fade, Margaret's strength never wavered. The attack didn't define her. Margaret proved that even in the face of unimaginable pain, resilience could lead to recovery. Her story became one of hope, not just for herself but for the entire town. This tragedy left a lasting impact on both the victim, Margaret Lewis, and the young boy, Jesse Stone. Margaret's life was forever changed, and Jesse, with his troubled past, will carry the weight of his actions. This event forces us to confront the loss of innocence and the importance of mental health awareness. It's a reminder to stay vigilant, support those in need, and foster conversations that could prevent such tragedies. Let's make our communities safer by raising awareness and supporting mental health initiatives. If you care about these stories, please subscribe to my channel. Your support helps bring these important issues to light.